May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I really mean that prayer this morning. I looked at my sermon this morning over breakfast and I thought, this doesn't work. This is just, it's not going to work. And then we had our morning prayer service online, and I think there were 9 of us there this morning. And we had a fabulous conversation. And so I have some new thoughts, and I'm going to try to share them with you in the form of a sermon. So Jesus is engaged in another controversy. The Pharisees and the scribes from the temple have come to him, and they're wondering, they're challenging him at least a little bit and saying, why don't your followers wash their hands before they eat, the ritual washing? Why don't they wash pots and pans the way we do, as in keeping with the tradition of the elders? The tradition of the elders is important. There's a book called the Mishnah, which is a compilation of oral laws. These are traditions that were important enough to be written down and debated and handed on. It's not as binding or as important as the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's not as binding as Moses' law, but it's important. And many of the Jews, not all, but many of the Jews of Jesus' time would have observed them. And so the scribes and the Pharisees want to know why, if Jesus is so serious about the kingdom of God, why don't his followers obey these laws? Now, as I have read this story through the ages, I have to admit that I've responded in a particular way that I was unaware of until just recently, until just this week, really, as I thought about preaching on this passage yet again. I look at this and I hear Jesus responding to the Pharisees, and what I've realized is that I am doing exactly what the Pharisees and the scribes are doing. I'm hearing Jesus as if what he's offering is a different set of laws, a different set of traditions, a different oral law, if you will. Okay, and so he's giving us a different way to know and love God, but still a set of rules to live by. And it may not involve washing hands. It may involve some other things, but there's clearly a set of rules. That's how I read it. That's how I have read it. But then this quote that Jesus chooses to read, to speak to those challenging him, I saw it in a different way. He quotes from Isaiah and he says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines." What if Jesus isn't offering a different set of rules, but a different way of reading the scriptures, the rules, the laws that we've been given? What if instead of giving us an alternative to Moses' law, he's giving us new eyes, a different way of hearing and reading and understanding and living that law? Their hearts are far from me. I think there's a key there to understanding this. Jesus is calling us to respond with our hearts. It's so easy to respond with our head. It's so easy to respond with reason and logic. I mean, we're taught that that's really the right way to enter into the world. There are many people in our congregation who have worked in the medical field as doctors and nurses and anesthesiologists, and I guarantee you they need to respond with their head, but not just with their head. Madeline worked with babies in the NICU, the neonatal intensive unit, right? She had to respond with her heart. I mean, all doctors do. And so what I want to do is look at how Jesus might be calling us to respond other than through logic and reason and debating. I had an interesting experience that for me helps me move in this direction. This was all the way back in the year 2000 when I was doing a hospital chaplaincy. So I was in the hospital working as a chaplain. It was a full-time program, 40 hours a week, for the whole summer. And one of the places that I was assigned to work was the mental unit, the mental ward, where they dealt with mental health. And this was a locked unit. And so in order to get in, you had to go through locked doors and there were codes to get in and stuff, and I didn't have the codes. But I was given the responsibility of running the daily spiritual discussion group. And I remember asking, well, what does a daily spiritual discussion group in a mental ward do? And they said, you'll figure something out. And so we went in and we sat in a circle, and I think there were about 10 people in the room, including myself. And lots of things were said, but the most interesting was this fellow who sat across from me and started describing the people that were around me and what they were saying and what they wanted. And I was sitting by myself. There was nobody around me. And so I found myself listening to everything that he said, trying to figure out how I could guide him back to reality so that we could have a proper conversation. I wanted him to get that what he was saying was illogical, that it didn't make sense. He couldn't be a Buddhist monk and a bishop in the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and what was he? And he grew up Baptist. I mean, he couldn't be all of these things. It just didn't make sense, and it was scary because, I mean, what do? I'm supposed to be helping, right? I'm supposed to be leading this spiritual discussion group. And he's just, how do you even communicate with him? And at some point, something he said got through. And I heard the emotion behind the illogical, I don't want to say crazy, but the illogical assertions that he kept making about invisible people and impossible experiences that he had had. And so I tried listening to the emotional undercurrent of what he was saying instead of judging the logic of what he was saying. And it turned out that he was very eloquent. He was telling me about his fears and his desire to be closer to God and closer to his family. That was the emotional undercurrent of everything that he was saying. And I tried that. From that point on, I kept trying that, listening for the emotion, the emotional message, the heart message, instead of judging and parsing the logic of reality of the people that I was interacting with. What if Jesus is calling us to do something like that with the law? What if Jesus is calling us to respond with our hearts rather than the rules or the laws or the traditions? I had another experience around the same time. My seminary is in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right next to Washington, D.C. You can ride your bike into D.C. in 20 minutes. It's right there in the D.C. metro area. And so one of the things that we would do is go to church in our first year when we were looking for a place to do a field ed placement, internship. We would go to various churches. And I decided I wanted to visit one of those high church places, one of those smells and bells churches, because I had never really done that as an adult. And so I went to the famous one called St. Paul's K Street. And it was a remarkable experience. Very traditional neo-Gothic structure with, straight rows of pews and a choir section, and they entered with incense, leading the procession with a censer. And then this really fascinating thing happened. There had to have been at least a dozen people involved in the care of the altar. And they literally marched in exactly matching steps, and they got to the center of this sort of open area, and they turned all as one, like a drill team. And then they all genuflected, and they all went down exactly together, and they all came up together. And then they turned, and they moved off to their various places. It made the skin on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know why, but it just did. It was so precise. It's like it didn't belong, for me, it didn't belong in church. I was a little bit surprised and confused by it. And then the priest came out to read the gospel, and he used his censer again, and he put incense on the gospel and on the congregation, and then he chanted the gospel, which I would have thought would be beautiful, but through the whole thing, I felt like I was being excluded, like I didn't really fit in somehow, that I couldn't be that precise. I couldn't follow this Mishnah, this tradition of the elders in the way that they were doing it. It was completely alien to me. And I came away from having visited that church feeling like I hadn't been to church, like I'd been to a show or something. And then I went to our own St. Paul's on K Street here in Seattle, which coincidentally is also a high church, smells and bells. Literally, they have bells they ring during the service, and the incense they swing as they come in, and all of the same accoutrement, the same liturgy that St. Paul's K Street in Washington, D.C. had. And I went there because someone had recommended it to me, and I sat there and I felt like I was just being swept up in this beautiful worship. And it was all the same stuff, the incense and the chanting and all of that. But it had a completely different feel to it. Whereas in D.C., it felt like everything had to be just so and precise and exact, and the choreography was exacting. At St. Paul's here in Seattle, it was this experience of people using these things to express love from their hearts for God and for one another. It was a completely different experience. And I think that illustrates what Jesus is getting at, that there is a heart to the law of Moses. So we're not talking about rejecting the law of Moses. We're talking about seeing with our hearts. So here's the thing that happened this morning that really caused me to throw this out, to just abandon this manuscript. We were reading that lesson from James. And in the lesson from James, there's that strange paragraph about looking in the mirror. We've all read that so many times. I've always wondered about that. What is it? I guess I can see that if somebody spent a lot of time looking in the mirror and then they went away, they might want to see themselves again if they're so wrapped up in it, or you forget what you look like. But it's never really made sense to me, this reference to looking in the mirror. So it says here, be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, if we think that that's who we are, we're placing our identity outside of ourselves. We're placing our self-identification in what we see and what other people see in us. That's what came to me this morning, is that the looking in the mirror, it's not so much that you forget what you look like, it's that the very act of looking in the mirror for who you are is looking outside of yourself. Whereas what James and Jesus are calling us to do is to see with our hearts, to know who you are from your heart, from the inside. Because love is something that we do. The letter of James is famous for how practical it is and how full of telling us what to do it is. It's so full of that Luther rejected it because he was so committed to the idea that we are saved by faith and not by works, right? But what if what James is saying is that our works need to come from that heart that is within us, from the love of God that is present around us and among us, in us and for us and through us for the world? What if that heart connection is what James is calling us to? Now, I speak a lot in my own teaching and preaching about practices. I encourage people to engage in daily prayer, whether it's saying grace at meals or the Lord's Prayer at some regular time during your day, or the more formal morning prayer and compline that we do each day online. And I say those things not because by doing them you will earn God's favor, but that my experience is that in doing them, my heart is engaged, that I find that connection with others and with God. And I think that's what's going on here, because love is more than a feeling. Love is something that we do, and James urges us to be doers of the word. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. And the word is the name that is given to Jesus. The word became flesh. That word is not about logic. It is not about giving us a new set of laws to live by, or a replacement for the rules of kosher, or a replacement for the law of Moses. The word is about the love of God becoming flesh. Your flesh, my flesh, our flesh. Jesus present, revealing to us how to live within the love of God and to express that love. The Word is about the heart of God and our hearts learning to listen and live from the heart. The Pharisees and the scribes wanted to debate true religion with Jesus, and they expected a debate on the law, the interpretation of the law, and the right way to live out that law, and the right ways to worship. And that was the kinds of questions that they engaged in. And that's how I used to hear Jesus' answer. But Jesus instead responded by pointing to the heart. And I think maybe that's what James is getting at too. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world.